Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a truly epic journey, not just across places, but deep into time, millions of years back. We're going to explore something absolutely fundamental about, being human, how we actually learn from each other, our focus, the evolution of learning and teaching cultural transmission, stretching back something like 3.3 million years. And we're not just theorizing, we're using hard archaeological evidence. Yeah, our guide for this deep dive is this fascinating new paper in PLOS ONE. Researchers looked really closely at 103 specific cultural traits from the Paleolithic, things our ancestors made, things they did, and from that, they built this empirically based picture of how the process of passing on culture evolved. So our mission today is to unpack all that rich detail with you. We'll pull out the key insights about how our ancestors shared knowledge, and importantly, what that tells us about the roots of human culture, maybe even language itself. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding that deep, deep history of human learning.
And it really is a remarkable picture they paint. The study shows these pretty clear trends in how cultural transmission changed over that vast time scale. It reveals this really deep co-evolutionary dynamic. As cultural stuff got more complex.
Like tools or rituals.
Exactly. As those things got more complex, the strategies for sharing that knowledge also had to become more sophisticated. It wasn't just about raw intelligence, it was fundamentally about how they taught and learned.
Okay, let's dig into that.
Oh,
But
wow.
maybe first, let's just set the scene a bit. What exactly are we talking about when we say cultural transmission? And why is looking at its evolution so critical?
Right. So at its core, culture in this context is basically information. Information that shapes behavior, but specifically information you get from others through social learning. Think imitation, someone showing you something, explicit teaching, that kind of thing.
And it's important to remember, like you said, to define that way. It's not uniquely human, right? Lots of animals learn
Right.
socially.
Absolutely. Many species have traditions passed down through social learning, but where the human story gets really distinct is with what we call cumulative culture.
Yeah.
This isn't just copying. It's about innovations being built upon generation after generation. You get this progressive accumulation of
The
complexity.
ratchet effect, yeah. You
Yeah.
add something new, and that becomes the baseline for the next step.
Precisely. It leads to behaviors and technologies that are way too complex for any single person to invent from scratch. And humans seem to do this in different ways. Sometimes it's about getting better and better at exploiting one thing, like, say, flint knapping. Other times it's about combining different ideas or materials in new ways, recruiting additional natural phenomena, as the researchers put it.
Right, and there's obviously a lot of ongoing discussion about why cumulative culture became such a big deal for humans, whether it's truly unique.
Yes, absolutely. Folks like Tenney, Stout, Van Schaik, they've looked into the ecological, the social conditions needed for it, vital questions. But this study zeroes in on something slightly different, but just as crucial: the how, the actual mechanisms of transmission. How is this increasingly complex knowledge actually passed along? Understanding those specific strategies, that's key to grasping the evolution of cumulative culture itself.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, like you said.
Yeah.
They didn't just theorize. They went straight to the archaeological record.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
anchored the whole thing in the physical evidence left behind. What can the artifacts tell us about the learning needed to make them?
So how on earth do you figure out how someone learned to make, say, a hand axe 3 billion years ago, just from looking at the hand axe? What methods did they use?
Well, it was a pretty clever, multi-pronged approach. They analyzed those 103 specific cultural traits you mentioned, and that covers a huge range, different stone tool types, sure, but also bone tools, beads, using pigments, even things suggesting complex behaviors like formal burials or using compounded poison later on.
Wow, so things like eyed needles
Mm,
or complex bifacial shaping stuff that
Mm.
clearly wasn't obvious. You had to learn it somehow.
definitely. And for each of those 103 traits, they tried to figure out what combination of transmission strategies would have been necessary for that skill to actually stick around in a group to be passed down successfully.
Okay, and how did they work that out? It wasn't just guesswork, right?
No, not at all. They drew on several lines of evidence. They looked at archaeological analyses of chains operatoires, basically the step-by-step sequences involved in making something. They consulted ethnography. How do traditional societies today pass on similar kinds of skills?
Mm-hmm.
They used insights from experimental archaeology, where people actually try to learn these ancient techniques themselves and see what's involved.
Right, learning by doing, essentially.
Yep. And they also looked at ethology, how animals learn from each other. And crucially, they brought in experts, archaeologists, anthropologists who specialize in these periods and technologies.
So it's kind of triangulating from the object itself, modern parallels, and actually trying it out.
That's a good way to put it. And what's really fascinating, they were careful about potential biases. Like, stone tools preserve way better than, say, wooden spears.
Or dating uncertainties.
Exactly. But they ran analyses to check if these issues might skew the results, and they found that the broad, long-term patterns of how transmission evolved still held up. The big picture seemed robust.
That definitely adds weight to the findings. Okay, so using this toolkit, they figured that transmission happens across 3 main dimensions. What are they?
Right. They broke it down into 3 aspects of the interaction between the expert, the practitioner, and the learner, the novice. They called them the spatial, temporal, and social dimensions.
Okay, let's take those one by one. Spatial.
The spatial dimension is about the physical relationship and, importantly, the intentionality involved. At the simplest end, you've got observation, maybe distant, where the expert doesn't even know the learner's watching.
Just peeking from behind a rock?
Sort of,
Yeah.
or closer observation, where the expert might notice the learner but isn't actively trying to teach them. They just tolerate them being nearby.
Okay, just watching.
But then it ramps up. The expert might become conscious. The learner is there to learn. And then you get proximate observation with practitioner intentionality, where the expert deliberately facilitates the learning.
How? Like slowing down?
Yeah, maybe slowing down, exaggerating movements, making things clearer, and it can get even more hands-on.
Like physically guiding them?
Exactly. That's gesture molding, physically guiding the learner's hands or body, maybe even giving feedback alongside that guidance.
Okay.
And then as things get more complex, you start needing modes that imply, well, more sophisticated communication.
You mean talking about it?
Pretty much. Like explanation complemented action, the expert explains while they're doing the task. That requires some ability to talk about steps, goals, why you're doing something.
Right.
And even eventually, explanation in the absence of action. Just telling someone how to do something or explaining a concept without actually performing the action at that moment. That points strongly towards needing articulate language or something very similar.
Wow. Yeah. That spectrum from just watching to abstract explanation. That covers a massive leap in cognitive and communication demands. What about the temporal dimension?
The temporal dimension focuses on how the learning is structured over time. Timing, frequency, the order of things. Simplest case, maybe you learn something in one single information transfer.
Or you practice the same single thing over and over.
Right. Repetitive single information transfer, like practicing one specific napping technique repeatedly.
Okay.
But for more complex skills, you might need sequential information transfer, learning steps A, then B, then C in that specific order because it matters.
Makes sense.
Or things can get even more structured. Modular information transfer is interesting here. You learn different distinct chunks or modules of a skill. Maybe you learn them out of order and they can be combined later, maybe even used in different larger tasks.
Like learning separate components you can assemble in different ways.
Exactly. And then there's even disconnected information transfer. This is where you learn bits and pieces, maybe practice certain actions, but their actual purpose or how they fit into the bigger picture only becomes clear much later when you integrate them. That's quite sophisticated teaching and learning.
Yeah, that requires some real planning and foresight from the teacher and trust from the learner. Okay, so spatial is the how of interaction. Temporal is the structure over time. The third dimension was social.
Right. The social dimension is about who learns from whom. The classic ones are vertical parent to child, horizontal between peers or siblings, and oblique from other relatives or non-parental adults.
Okay, the family and peer group.
Yeah, but it can be broader or more specific. You can have selective versions where specific experts are sought out to teach particular learners.
Not just learning from anyone.
Exactly. Or you can have more generalized modes. Generalized hyperoblique means pretty much any expert could teach any novice in the wider group, regardless of kinship.
More community-based learning.
Kind of. And then there's selective generalized hyperoblique, where even within that wider group, teaching might be structured by, say, status or gender, not just who happens to be related.
Interesting.
The paper also notes that reciprocal transmission, younger teaching older, didn't seem to be a major factor for these Paleolithic traits they studied.
Got it. So, okay, just to recap. They took 103 traits, figured out the likely mix of spatial, temporal, and social strategies needed for each, and then looked at how the importance of these different strategies changed over 3.3 million years, based on which traits were around when. So what's the big story? What did they find?
The big story is one of, well, increasing complexity and sophistication in teaching and learning, happening alongside the increasing complexity of the culture itself. It wasn't really a sudden revolution, more like a long, gradual unfolding process.
Let's walk through that timeline. What did the really early periods look like, say, pre-600,000 years ago?
In that earliest phase, from 3.3 million up to about 600,000 years ago, observation was key spatially. But interestingly, just distant watching seems to fade relatively early. What was significant, even back then, was proximate observation with that practitioner intentionality we talked about.
So even for making those very early, relatively simple tools, it wasn't just pure imitation or trial and error. It suggests some level of active showing or guidance.
That's what the analysis points to, yeah. Some form of engaged interaction, maybe not verbal but deliberate, seems necessary quite early on. Temporarily, things were dominated by learning in single events or through repetition. Socially, it was mainly non-selective learning from whoever was around in your group. Selective teaching wasn't really a big thing yet.
Okay, then we hit the middle periods, maybe 600,000 down to around 200,000 years ago. What changes?
This period looks like a major transition zone. Spatially, that intentional proximate observation is still important, but it starts to decline a bit as explanation-complemented action begins to emerge and play a significant role.
So explanation starts creeping in alongside demonstration.
Exactly. Temporarily, simple repetition starts losing ground, while sequential transfer learning steps in order becomes progressively more important. Modular learning also pops up, though maybe more sporadically at first. And socially, while the non-selective modes are still used, the selective modes seeking out specific teachers gradually start to gain relevance.
It sounds like a period of maybe exploration. Like the cultural toolkit was getting bigger, and they were starting to need and use a wider range of teaching methods.
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. The demands were changing, pushing towards more varied, maybe slightly more structured ways of passing things on.
And then we get to the more recent period, say the last 200,000 years or so, up to the end of the Paleolithic. This is where things really shift.
Yeah, this is where the strategies we strongly associate with complex human culture really come to the fore. Spatially, explanation complemented action becomes, like, the key mode. And crucially, explanation in absence of action emerges and grows in importance, especially after about 50,000 years ago.
Which, again, strongly hints at the need for and use of complex language, right?
Yeah.
Abstract communication.
It's a very powerful signal, yes. Temporally, modular transfer learning, those reusable chunks, becomes the predominant strategy. Disconnected transfer also gets more relevant, and sequential learning stays important too.
So really structured ways of breaking down and teaching complex skills.
Definitely. And socially, those selective modes become really widespread. After about 100,000 or 50,000 years ago, they're almost as common as the non-selective ones. People were likely actively choosing their teachers based on expertise.
Right. And you mentioned something fascinating earlier, asynchronicity. The timing wasn't perfectly aligned.
Yes, that's a really interesting finding. The analysis suggests the shift towards explanation-based spatial modes started earlier, maybe around 400,000 to 300,000 years ago. But the shift towards those highly structured temporal modes, modular, disconnected, seems to really take off later, maybe more like 200,000 years ago.
Huh. Why the lag? Why would explanation come first?
The researchers suggest a compelling reason. Those really complex temporal structures, like modular or disconnected learning, they probably depend on having effective communication already in place. You need to be able to explain concepts, relationships between steps, why you're learning this piece now, even if its use isn't obvious yet. That kind of abstract explanation likely needed to develop before you could effectively structure teaching in those sophisticated ways.
Ah, I see. So the ability to explain it effectively sort of paves the way for teaching in more complex, nonlinear ways later on. That makes intuitive sense. Okay, so pulling all this together, this huge evolutionary story about how we learned, what are the big implications? What's the so what for understanding us?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that the evolution of how we teach and learn wasn't just a side effect of culture getting complex. It was an essential driver and enabler of that complexity. As technologies, symbolic behaviors, social rules became more intricate, the old, simpler ways of passing them on just wouldn't cut it anymore.
You needed more deliberate, more structured, more explicit ways to ensure knowledge wasn't lost.
Exactly, and this feeds directly into thinking about language evolution, the growing reliance on explanation, on structured teaching. It points strongly towards a need for increasingly sophisticated communication.
It really seems to bolster that pedagogical hypothesis, doesn't it? The idea that the sheer challenge of teaching complex skills was a major pressure-shaping language.
It aligns very, very well, and the study adds a nice layer, suggesting it wasn't just about tools. The demands of transmitting symbolic knowledge, the meaning of ornaments, the steps in a ritual likely added just as much pressure for better communication.
Right, it's the whole cultural package, not just the technology.
Precisely, and it emphasizes that this wasn't some overnight change, no single behavioral modernity switch flicked. It was this long, gradual back and forth between culture getting more complex and teaching methods adapting over hundreds of thousands, even millions of years, and that rise of selective social transmission later on. That tells us something about society, too. It suggests growing specialization. Expertise mattered more.
So you needed ways to find the expert.
You needed ways to find them, and maybe society was becoming structured in a way that facilitated that. More division of labor, perhaps.
Implies a more complex social landscape for learning.
Yes. And finally, that dominance of modular and disconnected learning in later periods. That fits perfectly with the kind of cumulative culture that involves combining different principles, or learning things whose utility isn't immediately obvious. Type 2 cumulative culture.
So this journey of how we learned is fundamentally tied to our ability to build these incredibly complex cultures that define us. It wasn't just about getting smarter brains. It was about developing smarter ways to share what was in those brains.
Exactly. And the paper even floats the idea that this interplay, this coevolution between culture and transmission, could have actually influenced our cognitive evolution itself. The demands of teaching and learning complex things might have been a selective force acting on our minds.
That's a pretty profound thought, that teaching actually helps shape our brains. Okay, so to wrap up this really mind-bending deep dive across 3.3 million years.
What we've seen is this incredible trajectory from our earliest ancestors relying mostly on observation and repetition to much later humans using really complex, intentional, language-based, structured and selective ways to pass on an ever more complex cultural inheritance.
And it wasn't just one thing leading the other, but this constant feedback loop. Culture gets more complex, demanding better teaching. Better teaching allows culture to get even more complex.
It really underscores that being human is inseparable from this capacity for high-fidelity social learning, for cumulative culture built layer by layer and critically enabled by how we share knowledge.
And the researchers point towards next steps too, right? Like trying to correlate these shifts with other lines of evidence.
Yeah, exactly. Looking for connections between, say, the timing of these transmission strategy shifts and periods of significant brain size increase, encephalization.
Or environmental factors.
Right. Could periods of climate change or instability have put a premium on groups that were better at reliably transmitting crucial survival knowledge? Lots of fascinating avenues to explore.
So thinking about how absolutely central these evolving teaching and learning strategies were for our ancestors, for building everything from tools to symbolic culture, perhaps even driving language, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does it mean for us today in our own hyper-complex, information-overloaded world? How are we adapting the how of transmission?
That's the question, isn't it? Are our methods keeping pace with the complexity we're creating?
What really stands out to you from this immense journey into the roots of human learning?